So if you would tell us your name, where you were born, and when you came to the United States.
My name is Jose Borrajero, and I was born in Cuba, came to the United States in 1961.
In 1961. So this was shortly after the Castro Revolution.
Well, the Castro Revolution, Castro took over in 1959. The Bay of Pigs invasion happened in 1961, in the spring of 1961. So this was shortly after the Bay of Pigs.
And how old were you when you left Cuba?
Just shy of 16. My birthday was in December, and I came in November.
So you were old enough to really kind of see what was happening and have some understanding of what was going on in your country at that time.
Absolutely. In fact, when you are in that kind of a situation, you grow very fast, very quickly.
Okay. So what was your life like in Cuba before the Castro Revolution?
We were part of the middle class. My dad was a carpenter, and also he worked for the police department in certain ways. But we were just average citizens. Go to work, go to school, nothing out of the ordinary.
And what was it about Batista that allowed Castro to take advantage of what I presume to be some discontent with Batista, to allow him to come in and foment this overthrow of the Batista government?
Well, Batista was pretty much like a typical Latin American dictator. He came to power not via elections, but via coup d'etat. However, he did hold elections. Some say that they were rigged. They may have been, maybe not. But he was what you might call a more or less benevolent dictator. In other words, if you did not cross him, you have pretty much free reign. So, go ahead.
Okay, so Castro was educated. I think very few people probably know this, at least those under maybe the age of 40, don't know that Castro was actually educated here in the United States and then went to Cuba and led the revolution. At that time, the folks in the United States thought this was a good thing, and they were kind of behind Castro. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree completely. He somehow gave the impression that he was doing something good. See, most people are not aware of how he started the revolution, because I believe the year was 1952. I don't know for sure, but I think it was 1952, July 26, 1952. How he started the revolution was by a raid on an army outpost out in the Oriente province in the eastern part of Cuba. It was a surprise attack. The soldiers had no chance, and it was just pretty much a slaughter of soldiers in there. So it was not a very favorable type of situation. But most people don't know about that or don't care.
And what did Castro promise the people of Cuba, the middle class, maybe even the peasant class, the lower class? What did he promise them to get their cooperation in all of this?
Well, the promises actually was just pretty much get rid of the dictator, because we actually had the middle class had it pretty good in Cuba. It was not a matter of everybody being oppressed or anything of that nature. We did have some folks, of course, in the countryside. The peasants were not quite as up to snuff as, well, they might be in the United States, but by Latin American standards, we had a very high standard of living. But the main thing was that Batista was a dictator. He came to power via coup d'etat, and that did not sit well with some of the people. And then also, whenever people start uprising, then it has a tendency to create overreaction from the part of the government. And some of that did happen and did nothing but turn people off. But that was basically what was happening there.
And after Castro was successful in dethroning Batista, did he not promise a redistribution of wealth and a redistribution of the land? Was that part of what he promised the people?
Absolutely. And not only did he promise it, he delivered, except, as usual, when the socialists get in there and do the distribution, it's more like a grab of power where it's not really given to the people. The people all become peasants at that point. The only people that have any power or any say in anything are the commissars, the government folks.
So the promise does not match the reality.
No way. It never does in these situations.
Okay. So now, once Castro came to power in Cuba, there was a point at which he embraced Khrushchev. Khrushchev came to Cuba, or Castro went to Moscow, and they embraced. And at that point, I think a lot of people were very surprised and felt that Castro suddenly was being pushed into the arms of the Soviets, and that the United States was at fault for that we had maybe done something wrong or pushed Castro away and didn't support him. But really, he was a socialist from the beginning, was he not?
Well, let me give you a little background. As he was out in the country fomenting his revolution, we referred to him as a watermelon. And because the uniform of the rebels was olive green, and we referred to him as being green on the outside and red on the inside, as a watermelon would be.
Well, that description has been recently applied to the environmental movement, where everyone wants to be green, earth-friendly, but red on the inside, and motivated by socialism or communism.
It applies to both groups, yes. He was a socialist from day one. There's no question about it.
Well, he even admitted as much in saying that he was a Marxist-Leninist from his student days, but I hid it, he said, for had I not done so, I could not have brought the revolution to a successful conclusion. Let's talk about right at the moment of the takeover. Castro organized block by block, and what happened when they went through the various neighborhoods? What was that like?
Well, there was several stages of this. The first initial thing that happened was a roundup of those people that were thought to be either sympathizers, well, not so much sympathizers, but they were accused of having committed crimes regarding the revolution. And those were tried in what they call kangaroo courts, I think. In other words, the trials were not very fair, and some of them were executed for their participation in the Batista regime.
Right.
And that was the initial thing. Now, beyond that, that is the Castro government organized what we called, or what was called at the time, committees for the protection of the revolution. I may not have the words exactly right, but something to that effect, whereby each block, each neighborhood, and by block actually, had at least one household whose task was to keep an eye on the rest of the neighborhood and to report on any so-called suspicious activity. So it was very difficult for anybody to mount a counter-revolution or doing anything of that nature, because they were being watched very, very carefully.
And there was a confiscation of arms, and was there not people moved into other people's homes? Is that correct?
We experienced that ourselves. So I can tell you from experience, this is not hearsay, this is not something I read in a book.
It's okay. This is a very emotional experience that you have gone through, because your freedom was suddenly taken away from you, and that's a very, very difficult thing to go through. And I appreciate you taking the time and making the effort to tell us, because so many people here in the United States today don't understand or realize what they are advocating for and what the end result of that is going to be. And that's why we wanted you to tell your story, because there's so many folks out there that don't appreciate, as you do, what they might lose in this process. So if you can, tell us what happened when they redistributed the wealth and redistributed the property.
Well, we had some rental property, and they simply took it away and placed people in there against our will, of course, and we lost whatever income we were having from that property. And as far as the confiscation of arms, I still remember very vividly when the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. My dad was taken to a concentration camp, and they came to our house. And I still remember how they knocked on the door with the butts of the rifles. Boom, boom, boom. They came in, they confiscated my BB gun, my little Daisy BB gun, and my brother's. They couldn't find any firearms. We didn't have any. but they confiscated the BB guns.
So even toy guns and BB guns and probably air pistols and all of that was taken away.
Correct.
And Jose, if we can, they moved people. Did they move people into your home personally, or just your rental property?
Just a rental.
Yeah,
just a rental.
So they were repositioning people to where they wanted them to be. All of this in the name of fairness and equality, I would guess.
In the name of fairness and equality, but in fact, the people that were placed in other people's properties were people who were favorable to the revolution.
To the revolution, and let's see if we can bring in now Che Guevara. Che Guevara was Fidel Castro's right-hand man. Tell us what you know or what you remember about Che Guevara.
The only thing I remember about Che Guevara was that, yes, in addition to being Castro's right-hand man, he was pretty much like his executioner. This man was bad news. He's a murderer. I think he was from Argentina initially. I don't know exactly, but he made it his business to travel around Latin America fomenting this sort of thing. After he finished in Cuba, he went to another country. I believe it was Colombia. I don't know for sure, but I think he was finally killed. Thank God he was killed in Colombia, if I remember correctly.
And these young people now, you live here in the United States, and from time to time, I'm sure you see young people at the shopping mall or in the grocery store wearing a Che Guevara T-shirt. And tell us, what does that say to you? What does that bring up?
Well, there's not much you can do because they've just been ignorant. They don't know what they're doing. But the reaction, the gut reaction, is to punch them in the nose. But of course, we don't do that.
Now, there is a large Cuban community down in Florida, and we are coming up now on the Florida primary. Tell us, what does the Cuban community look for? What do they want to hear?
In terms of
well, in terms of our relationship with Cuba, what are they looking for? Are they satisfied with the status quo, or would they like to see change?
Well, this is going to be my personal opinion, okay? Yes, they are satisfied. From what I can understand, they are satisfied with the present condition. That is not a good thing. I'm a firm believer that we should lift whatever embargo we have on Cuba. And there's a very good reason for that. Number one, the United States is the only country that has the embargo. China trades with Cuba. Mexico trades with Cuba. Canada, all of Latin America, they have no shortage of trade. So all that means is that our goods don't make it to Cuba and that we don't get Cuban goods, but everybody else can trade with them. Plus, it gives Castro a very, very good excuse for the shambles that his economy is in, because every time something bad happens, the Yankees did it. It was the fault of the United States. If they did not have this embargo on poor us Cubans, none of this would happen. And that's the line of thinking, and that's what he has. And unfortunately, from what I understand, I may be wrong on this, but my understanding is that most of the Cubans in Florida do not want normalizations, or that is the lifting of the embargo, because they feel that somehow that would be an acceptance of Castro. But they're wrong. If trade were to be resumed, then the Cuban people who are there, who for 50 years have seen nothing but communism, they have no idea as to what a free world looks like. They would get a glimpse of that, pretty much like it happened in the Soviet Union. And they would have a much better means of more likely to oppose the government.
So trade would actually work in our favor. However, at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States promised two things in order to agree with Khrushchev for removing the missiles from Cuba. One was that we would remove our missiles from Turkey, the United States missiles from Turkey. But the other was that we would never again interfere with the Castro regime the way that we did with the Bay of Pigs. And that has left Castro in power all of these years with no real effective opposition. Would you agree?
Of course, I would agree, but let me point out that the intervention at the Bay of Pigs was no big deal either. because the support that Kennedy was supposed to have given the rebels that tried to invade Cuba was withdrawn very quickly. So he pretty much reneged on his promise. Right. So there was not much going on. So the Bay of Pigs was not a big deal for the United States.
But it did draw the attention of Moscow and the leaders over there that they were afraid that something else may come behind that and topple Castro, and he was their foothold in the Western Hemisphere.
Correct. It did bring that to their attention. But to keep in mind, by that time, Castro already had MiGs. Keep in mind that he had a pretty powerful army by that time. Keep also in mind that we had these committees to protect the revolution that kept an eye on people. And just like I said earlier, when this happened, there was a roundup of people that were put in concentration camps. This is interesting. The concentration camps, in case you don't know, it was baseball stadiums. What they did is they put the people in a baseball stadium, put up a fence, and machine guns around. And that's how they kept the prisoners, because there were so many of them, there were not enough jails for them. So that's and the combination of that, plus the fact that they had jet aircraft, and the combination also the fact that Kennedy did not provide the air support that he was supposed to, all these three things combined led to a resounding defeat for the invading forces.
Right. Now, under Castro's Marxist government, tell us what life was like on a daily basis. They controlled every aspect of your daily life, did they not?
Correct. And the way that we noticed the daily life to change most dramatically, in addition to the lack of freedom, which is pretty dramatic in itself, but the day-to-day affairs, it was always a matter of how long do I have to stand in line in order to get a basic staple. You want to buy meat? Well, you have to go in line. You have a card. It's a ration card. And then you go and you stand in line and wait for your turn to buy whatever is available, which in most cases, by the time you got there was nothing left. Okay? And the same thing with all kinds of staples, bread, flour. It was nothing. It was very difficult to obtain anything. You had to stand in line for everything, shortages of all kinds of things. And we did not have any of those shortages prior to that. So what happened was that the way that they tried to micromanage the economy, the same way as they always do in a communist regime, you take the incentive from the people to have a profit and to work hard. Things are going to happen, and what happens usually is you have shortages, and you have people who don't work as hard as they could, and so that's what we had going on by the time I left.
Now, many people say that the reason socialism hasn't worked is because the right people haven't tried it yet or haven't been in charge of it yet. Based on your experience, what would you say to those folks that think that, we just need to refine it and get better people in charge?
Well, they've been tried, and every time that it has been tried, you would think by now they would have found at least 2 or 3 people who knew what they were doing, right? They haven't, because it's the system that doesn't work. The system does not work. If I have a product and I want to sell it to you and you're willing to pay a price, I'm willing to work for that. I'm willing to provide that product and work hard so I can make a profit. But when the government tells me what I need to do, and regardless of how hard I work or what I do, I get the same type of compensation, then what incentive do I have to improve myself? So that's very basically what happens.
Now, in order to protect this revolution and these Marxist ideas, the children in Cuba, I understand, were taken at a very young age and placed in school away from their families. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct. And I forget the name of the program, whatever you call it, it's that. You had these uniforms. They remind me quite a bit of what the Nazis did. But that was indoctrination from day one. It's what happened.
And they determine what profession you can go into and how much education you receive, and then ultimately your pay scale is determined by the government.
Correct. And in fact, it went even beyond that, because it also included some of the old folks. What happened around, in fact, this is before I came in 1961, the government initiated a program to teach people who did not know how to read or write, to teach them how to read or write. And this entailed mostly going out in the countryside, the peasants and so on. Good idea, right? What could be better than to teach people to read and write? However, the material that they used, the first words that these people read were nothing but communist propaganda. So this was a way of indoctrinating not just the youth. See, you're talking about older people as well. And this is one thing, as a matter of fact, I don't know how many people know this, but all high school students that year were given a holiday. In other words, the whole year, or half the year actually, was declared a high school holiday. Why? So that the high school kids could volunteer to go out in the countryside and teach people how to read and write.
Using Marxist communist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some of us did not choose to do that, and of course we were marked because we refused to volunteer, and that's one of the triggers for my willing to come to the United States.
And how did you actually get out of Cuba and make it?
Well, I would like to tell you, a big long story about how I left in a little boat and had to fend off sharks and whatnot, but actually was not quite that glamorous. I boarded an airplane in Havana, Pan Am flight, forget the number of the flight, and landed in Miami, Florida, and that was the extent of it.
So at that point, somehow they were letting people go willingly?
Well, yes. We had two obstacles to overcome. One, of course, was that at that time in the United States, in order to obtain a visa, you had to show that you had the means of support, that you were not going to be a burden to society. And that's one thing we had to overcome. But the other thing was the exit visa, because not everybody was allowed to leave. And we did it by saying something to the effect that we were just going to study for a few months and then come back to Cuba.
Okay, so they weren't really aware that you were going for good.
Well, maybe they were and looked the other way. I don't know for sure. I don't think we fooled them that much. They're not that dumb. but still, that's what it took. Tell them that it was a temporary thing so that we could get an exit visa. And then at the other end, we had to arrange for, keep in mind, I was 15, not quite 16, and my brother was even younger. He was 13. So we were not adults by any stretch of the imagination.
So it was just the two of you that came?
Correct. Correct. And what had to happen is we had to find foster homes with somebody who would be willing to take care of us and guarantee in some measure that we were not going to be collecting welfare or in some other way be in the words of the state.
Right. Now let's talk about Cuban health care for just a moment. And I know you've been gone for a long time from there, but recently Cuba's national health care system has been touted as being quite efficient and people are well cared for and well provided for, and the doctors there are miracle workers and do great stuff. What is your impression of Cuban healthcare?
Well, a good indication as to the quality of that healthcare is what happened to Castro himself. His operation was not very well handled, was it? And you would think that he would have access to the best care available. No, what happens there is what happens with all of these so-called universal health care, and that is that, yes, there is a lot of health care available, but the quality is terrible. You still have to wait in line. You still have poor administration. You have poor dispensation of services. And, again, it's hard to believe, but then the elite do get the best care, and the rest of the people, they have to fend for themselves pretty much.
So wrapping all of this up, excuse me, when we talk to young people today who have never experienced what you have experienced, they have grown up in a land of freedom and a land of plenty, and they see that capitalism, in their minds, is unfair, that it penalizes some, that it steals the wealth from third world countries for us to be prosperous here. But you've actually lived through this. You've experienced this. What would you tell them? What is so wrong about socialism?
Well, the best advice that I can give them is to watch some tapes from Milton Friedman if they really want to know about socialism versus capitalism. What I can say now is that the profit motive is a good motive. You produce a service or a good, I am willing to pay for it. You are being selfish in the sense that you want to collect as much as you can, and I want to pay as little as I can, and somewhere we meet a balance. And we have a solid economy based on that. Whenever the government gets in the way and starts telling you what you can produce and tells me what I can buy, it just doesn't work.
Very good. Well, Jose, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your personal experience with us and tell us what life truly was like under socialism. And we welcome you. And you're now a naturalized citizen, is that right?
Correct. 1969, I became a U.S. citizen.
Second birth.
Second birth.
All right. Thank you. And we'll hope to catch up with you again sometime here on Western Free Press.